From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. Today we're focusing again on the Constitutional Convention, and we're focusing on a very special person, perhaps the single most important person in terms of bringing the convention forward and the product forward, and that is Leo Graybill, who was president of the Constitutional Convention. And he had a remarkable public and private career, but he's remembered best by those convention members who so respected the leadership that he provided in guiding the document itself forward and developing the sense of camaraderie and nonpartisanship that was the hallmark of that convention. And Leo was essentially playing against type in a way, because he'd historically been a partisan person. His family, himself, were ardent Democrats. Leo's father, Leo Graybill Sr., was a member of the Democratic National Committee for a number of years. His wife, Shirley, served on the Democratic National Committee when I happened to serve on that committee. We were elected at the same time. Leo was a candidate for Congress twice, in 1960 and 1962, as a Democrat. And he was a firm and unwavering Democrat in terms of principles. However, Leo understood the importance of the role of chair or president of the Constitutional Convention. And that's the story we're going to get into today, how in spite of that history of what looked like maybe partisanship or even hyper-partisanship, he rose above that and exhibited the kind of leadership qualities that stood Montana in good stead, and did a marvelous job of marshaling the resources and the strong personalities of the Constitutional Convention to bring about this marvelous document. Today we're going to have two special guests with us who are Constitutional Convention delegates. Both happen to be from Great Falls, which was where Leo was from. Arlene Reichert is with us. Arlene, you've heard from before as a member of the Legislative Committee of the Constitutional Convention, and she participated in a very informative and wonderful program there. And Bob Woodmansey, who is an educator from Great Falls, and this is his first show in our series, but he knows an awful lot about Leo, and we'll get into that. So I want to welcome both of you here. And to mention, I love your sunglasses, by the way.
Thank you.
And I know that these lights are pretty harsh on your eyes, and so you look wonderful with them, though. Maybe you ought to be doing Hollywood instead of here, you know.
Thank you.
And Arlene, your background we talked about in the previous show, but nonetheless, you came out of Buffalo, New York.
Right.
You met a Montana farm boy,
Right.
ended up in Montana getting married. As was the fashion of the time, and appropriately when possible, you were you managed the home and the children for, what was it,
23 years.
23 years. And when your husband had a fatal illness, you had been very active. You started to be very active. You were very active with the League of Women Voters.
Very much so.
And as I recall, you were an incoming president of the League when his illness took over, and you had to give that up. And that elevated Dorothy Eck into that presidency, or the chairman, the head of the League of Women Voters. But you stayed active through it anyway,
Right.
and were elected to the Constitutional Convention in 1971 special election. Where were you in that list of all those people running? How'd you fare? Did you do pretty well?
Surprisingly, I did, but for a few years previous to that, I ran for the legislature, and that was before we had single-member districts.
You had to run countywide.
Right.
You had about 20-some people on the ballot, right?
And 12 were selected, and I came in 13th. My son said, "You've always said be a good loser," and I try to be a good loser, but it deflates your ego. I was not happy being a loser, but it's the best thing that could have happened to me.
That was in 1970, was
Right,
it?
right.
And if you had won,
Right.
by the Supreme Court ruling later, you could not have been a convention delegate.
That's why I'm glad I lost.
You know.
I'm glad I was a loser. Because being a Constitutional Convention delegate has been one of the highlights of my life.
Yeah, so it's interesting, you don't know what things like that happen, you don't know how good they can be maybe.
Right.
And so you were on the CON, and then after that, you were at the time working at McLaughlin Institute, is that right?
When my husband became ill, fortunately, I had a wonderful position at McLaughlin Research, just starting out as executive secretary, but when I retired about 24 years later, I was assistant director.
Yeah, and you were there total how many years?
Almost 24.
And of course, after you retired, you didn't stop doing your doing, but you found a kind of a new special life. You decided those books weren't as important as Saving a Bridge. Tell me a bit.
I aspired to be a writer, a children's writer. I was going to write Frank stories. Oh, not the Frank that, little boy's name was Frank.
Yeah.
And I was going to do some history.
I wondered if you were talking about the content.
But as luck would have it, the bridge was destined to be destroyed, and there was an article in the paper that said, "New bridge to be built, old bridge to be torn down." One sentence said, "Old bridge to be torn down," and I wrote a letter to the editor, the power of the pen, and before we knew it, there was an army behind us, and we saved the bridge.
You saved the bridge, and now you're
Yes.
improving it every year. It's a challenge, but
4 years from now, in 2020, the bridge will be 100. I'll only be 94, God willing, and hoping that we have completed the bridge as far as getting across the bridge. Getting the trail
now,
across.
during this period after
Yes.
the CON, you actually decided you'd be in the legislature.
Yes.
But you managed, and you were elected in 1978 and served in the 79
Right.
session?
Yeah, I did.
And you only stayed one term.
That was enough. I know it was enough.
It was quite qualitatively different than the experience of the
Yes.
CON, wasn't
I
it?
had hoped that it would have been better because being in a Constitutional Convention delegate, as you know, Constitutional Convention was unicameral, one house. We wrote that Constitution. We didn't have another body down the hall. Had that happened, it might never have passed. But the point is that it was great working in that one chamber. 100 of us, we considered, we reconsidered, we hashed out details, and we came up with a Constitution. And so I thought, well, in 79, I'll give the legislature a chance as far as being a part of it. I didn't like the structure, but I liked it even less after being a part of it. I had one bill, a state local revenue sharing bill, that passed the House beautifully. I was a House member. Never could find it in the Senate. It was shifted from one committee to the other, and it was never really discussed. I just didn't like the structure, and I opted not to.
So you continued your civic activity,
Right,
however,
yes, yes.
and I know as a result of your work on the bridge and so many other things that you have done, that you were a recipient of the prestigious Paris Gibson Award in Great Falls for your civic activity. So
Paris Gibson was one of my idols. He was a Constitutional Convention delegate in 1889, and he was a commissioner in Great Falls, and one of his last acts was the installation of this beautiful bridge. So we had connections, but I was so honored to be received the prestigious Paris Gibson Award just recently.
Well deserved,
Thank
by
you.
the way. Well, thank you and welcome on board, and we'll move forward to discussing Leo in a second. Bob, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And Bob is a retired educator.
That's right.
You were a teacher, a counselor, a dean of students, or was it dean of students or boys?
Well, I was dean of boys in those days, so all I did was deal with boys, and it was all attendance and discipline.
That's a challenge enough dealing with boys alone, you know. What do you think
It
about
was
it?
interesting, and some others said they wouldn't have that job, but it's the job you do, and come home at night and be thankful that you're helping.
And you were born in Highwood, or
Raised-
born in Great Falls, but you know you were raised in Highwood
on a ranch in Upper Highwood Creek that's still in my family today. That my sisters, two sisters, and I, and my wife own.
in the Highwood Mountains. Huh?
In the Highwood
Oh,
Mountains.
that,
Yes.
what a nice place
Went
to be
to a
raised.
one-room school. Had the same teacher for 8 years.
Uh-huh.
A
And
wonderful woman.
no kidding with her either, was there? You know. And you ended up at Montana State College.
Yes.
Later Montana State University,
Yes,
as we know
yes,
it
that's
today.
correct.
It was MSc when I went too.
right.
So, but when I was there was the years they changed it.
That's
And we
correct.
had a tough time adjusting to an MSU after all those years. But you went to MSc and you got your degree in ag economics, and then you went and got a master's.
Well, I went after I got my degree in ag economics. The only job I could find was with the government in Washington, D.C., and I decided I'm a Montana boy. I didn't want to go to Washington, D.C., so I had met my wife, who later was my wife, Lois, before that, and we got married, and then she hadn't finished her degree, so we went back, and I got a master's degree in education, and she was able to finish her degree then, too. So. And then I got drafted. Can you believe at age 25, I was drafted with a master's degree.
No respect for the elderly. You know, here you were.
That's all right. I had been offered teaching jobs, but the military you serve, and I don't have anything wrong with that. I served and spent my time and came away, and
But you finished up right as the things were really starting to heat up in Vietnam, so you happened to miss the bulk of that. and
yeah,
were able to-
that's correct. Actually, I ended up in a recruiting center just like is here in Butte, Montana, and the testing section. And during that time, there was a Cuban Missile Crisis,
yeah.
and then we were sending observers into Vietnam. And if I had gone and become an officer, at which they offered me the opportunity to do, I would have ended up in Vietnam. And not that it was all bad, but I'm happy to be here today.
And well, again, you never know what is
No.
the fork in the road and what
That's
it
right.
means. But you ended up in the Great Falls school system,
Yes.
Junior high school, and then ultimately in overall
High
in the
school.
high school. And you were at CMR for,
Just 5 years at the end.
but your total was
31 years.
31 years. Well,
Yeah.
good for you. God bless you. Education's so important, and teachers and administrators are so important. You know, there's not a more important thing you could have done.
No.
But you retired, became a world traveler, I understand. You, the two of you
Yes.
go everywhere. Huh?
Well, Lois and I had traveled before, some in the summers, at times to Europe and that, but after she retired, why, yes, we've been all over the world. The only continent we haven't been is to Antarctica, but we've been to most of the countries in South America and most in Asia that you can travel to. And it's a wonderful experience to go and see how other people live and really decide that this is a wonderful place we live in, but the other places in the world, they do have their struggles. And,
Now, the United States is extremely diverse as a country compared to a lot of other countries, because we're essentially an immigrant country. Going around the world and seeing that, do you have a different eye toward the diversity of the United States?
Well, I've always think it's great. Of course, I go a little bit further because two of my granddaughters were adopted, each when they were a year old, from China. So I, I think diversity is wonderful. I had had an email from a son of mine who works for St. Louis University just this week, and he went up to Columbia, Missouri, to the university there this week, and he's going to do a project with 4 staff members there, and not one of them was born in the United States. They're all foreign professors that are there, and he's just so excited. He said, we're going to do great things. You know?
I suspect you're not particularly comfortable with concepts of building walls around our borders or artificial barriers to immigration.
I just think how better off we would be if we were taking the money to dig wells in Africa or do those sort of things that would help those who really need some help. You know, you go in those countries and you see how poor it is, women walking for miles with the pot on their head to get water or to wash clothes and those sort of things. It's you come home and think, yes, everything isn't like here, and it isn't Coca-Cola and everything else.
Well, we're going to talk about Leo and how important he was to the Constitutional Convention. And recently, I'm going to ask you to dive into that a little bit in terms of his overall background and stuff, because recently you were commissioned with the responsibility of doing a workup and a discussion about Leo for a wonderful thing they do in Great Falls of touring the cemeteries to famous gravestones and having people discuss for leaders of the community. So you did Leo, you got Leo. And why don't you give us kind of your thumbnails description and sense of Leo's history, if you would.
Well, Leo, interesting man. Yeah, if you go back before the convention time like that, I knew who his father was. His father ran meetings where in those days you would hold a gathering to decide who might run for the school board. And Leo's dad, Leo Graybill Sr., did that. So that was an early contact with the family. But with Leo, I had contact with his sons who were in school. Actually, 2 of them were in the junior high school when I was here. But you go back with Leo and look at his family. Came from Illinois, the father, been in the legislature there, and then the family came out here, and they lived in Belt, Montana. You know, that was the old coal mining town, Belt, and that's where the parents lived when Leo was born. And he was born in Great Falls, but they lived out in Belt, and then came into town. And of course, as I told the people on this tour, you see a name like Graybill, you might think it's a Native American name, you know. But here it was, Leo Graybill Jr. He was the second in the family. And he was a very bright student, did very well in school. And in high school, he was the state winner in speaking 4 years in a row. He actually, when they had a competition, he actually was speaking for who would be the best with Ted Schwinden, and he beat Ted Schwinden, and they were friends for years after that, you know. But anyway, Leo from this got after winning that speaking one year, he was given a trip to Northwestern University, and here by chance he met Shirley. They were both in high school at the time. Well, times went on, and Shirley was in Chicago studying drama, and Leo, after he graduated from high school, went to Yale Law School and graduated from there, from the university, then graduated with a law degree from Yale. But he came to Montana and got his Doctor of Jurisprudence at the University of Montana in Missoula. And then after that, came to Great Falls, and he and Shirley then somehow together, she was out in California, they got together and got married. So, and what a wonderful life it was, and what a great match Shirley was for Leo. Just there, and
It took quite a bit to match Leo.
yeah, but it was great, you know, great. And, you know, I would even see them in church and that sort of thing. But at one time they had a chance to do something with the television in Great Falls, you know, they owned that around. And then, of course, Leo was the attorney with a couple other attorneys in Great Falls. And Leo, of course, as we all know, ran for the National Congress twice against Jim Batten and didn't make it. And then when, of course, there was the primary election for the Con, well, Leo was one who was one of the persons running. And of course, at that time, we all ran in Cascade County. And I ran too, of course. I was known because I had been active with the teachers' organization. But of course, you picked 12 delegates, and in those days, why Cascade County was it seemed to lean more Democratic than Republican. Well, I ran as a Republican and was elected. And after we were elected, and of course, Arlene would tell you, but before the election, we were out at where they would have harvest and dinners and that. I was standing outside the door, shaking hands, telling them we were running for this. But anyway, after we had the election and were elected, was the idea of some that maybe we ought to get together, those who were elected, and talk about how things would go in organization and that. And Leo said in one of those meetings at the Rainbow Hotel in the morning, we'd have that he would like to run for president of the Constitutional Convention. And he got the backing of even people like Bob Noble, who was a Republican there in Great Falls. And
of course, the results of the election itself, at least partially because it was tied to the sales tax election and other issues at the time, 58 of the 100 were Democrats, and I think there were 6 independents, and then 30-some Republicans. And so it was pretty clear that the president was going to be a Democrat. So in Great Falls, they coalesced around him as the candidate.
Even Republicans, you see. So they saw him as somebody that could handle things, and you know, was at least to me easy to talk to and that sort of thing. So it worked well that way. And of course, then we had our pre-convention
the organizing session.
Organizing session, you know, on that. And it was interesting how that went.
Yeah, we'll talk about that because that's an interesting, some interesting stuff on that.
Yeah.
But this was this the only public office that Leo had elected to then?
Yes. Yes.
I guess if you're going to have one, this is was a darn good office to be elected to. He actually came in, of the 12 that were elected, you and he were pretty close at the bottom, weren't you?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, but that didn't stop him. He obviously felt strong enough about his capabilities, notwithstanding his not being the top vote getter or anything else in the county. You were a very high vote getter, as I recall.
Second after Father Urbanus.
Yeah, well, you couldn't beat the priest, you know. But I think God was on his side or something. But it was interesting because when there's a presumption that he was probably one of the top vote getters, but he wasn't. But he certainly came to the top when he went to the convention itself. You know, when we think about the organizing meeting, do you recall at that meeting, were you sitting alphabetically at the organizing meeting?
It was our decision, I think. Chet Blaylock brought up the subject. He said, you know, why don't we practice a little nonpartisanship. Just sit alphabetically, and it was a great idea. We all agreed, and Leah was 100%.
Do you recall, and when you had the organizing meeting, though, did you like go all the Great Falls people sit together on the floor and all the?
I believe we did when we got there originally.
So it wasn't predetermined, this alphabetical.
This happened in the orientation session. It was one of the best decisions that was made.
And
because it made all the difference in the world, and that's one of the differences with the legislature, where there's that immediate confrontation. Democrats on one side, Republicans
well,
on the
you
other.
got which side of the aisle are you on?
I wish the legislature would sit alphabetically. I think they'd be much more effective. But when Bob was talking about family, I have a little personal story about Shirley.
Sure.
Because I was raised in Buffalo, New York, as I said, and every Sunday afternoon there was a great program that was on nationally with Hoagie Carmichael, who was the composer of Stardust and Buttermilk Sky.
Georgia on My
It was
Mind.
wonderful, yes. And who was his sidekick on that radio program? Shirley. And she had a very distinctive voice. And I used to listen to that every week, long before I met my Montana farm boy husband. And so when I moved to Montana and was married in '45, the Graybills became good friends. Leo Jr.'s mother, Ada, kind of took me under her wing, got me on the library board. So we were personal friends. And when I heard that Shirley and Leo were in town, and I met Shirley and heard that distinctive voice.
Did you hear the voice? Huh?
Oh, yes. And I said, she said, yes, I worked for Hoagie Carmichael for quite a few years. She was the sidekick on the radio. So that was another personal connection. And Shirley was very important to the convention. As you alluded to, she was very socially minded. She brought everybody together, and it was a great experience, not only politically, but socially. We didn't let lobbyists affect us.
Well, I had a great affection for her, of course, when we were both elected to the Democratic National Committee together, and she served the one term. I served 3, but she served one term, and she was a joy to work with. I can tell you that. What a terrific person.
But Leo, in his own right, was just the right person at the right time. And when I looked over the proceedings recently, I noted toward the end of the convention, Vice President Toole had the opportunity to.
This is John Toole.
John Toole, yes.
And John was a Republican out of Missoula, but he was the vice president.
That's right. And he had the opportunity to introduce Leo at the very end. And when we talk about Leo and his characteristics, I think that this article just exemplifies the kind of person Leo was. And the lights won't bother me if I look this way.
Okay.
I'll read it if it's all right.
Sure,
with
that's
you.
fine.
And he said, fellow delegates and distinguished guests, the brief remarks that I'm about to make I consider to be the most significant and meaningful of anything I have said on this floor during this convention. In the lifetime of all of us, we encounter a few rare individuals whose personal qualities elevate him far above those surrounding him. Since last November, I've been privileged to be closely associated with such a man. This convention has completed its work within its allotted time. In fact, we did it in less time than it was allotted. And within the amount appropriated by the Legislative Assembly. We gave money back to the state. I would like to remind the delegates at this time that this was accomplished without once resorting to the gag rule. The man to whom I refer cajoled us, but he never commanded us. When toughness was required, he exhibited toughness. In an enterprise where fairness was vital, he was invariably fair. When physical endurance was required, it was he who set the standard for others to follow. When patient explanation of complex issues was demanded, he never failed us. He was effectively stern, but inexorably patient. His anger never flared, and his sense of humor never failed. And ladies and gentlemen, long after the rest of us were sleeping snug in our beds, this man labored over financial and administrative details. No item of unnecessary cost escaped his attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we must here today sign a great and progressive document which holds great promise for future generations of Montanans. In large measure, our accomplishment was made possible by the labors and the talents of this one man. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you your president, Leo Graybill, Jr. And I thought that says it all.
Wow, it certainly speaks to the level of respect, not before he did the job, but after he did the job.
Right.
And I think it speaks to the job that he did, and the product is evidence of that as well.
And everyone signed that Constitution. We were kind of apprehensive toward the end, but every one of the 100 delegates signed the document.
And a few of them worked against it, but not that many. But now I want back to this organizing. In my recollection in discussions with so many who were there was that in spite of the fact that they never did it again, that at the organizational meeting the Democrats met and the Republicans met at the beginning. And it was the Democrats had the job of coming up with a nominee, and I think about 8 of them wanted to do it, and they voted, and each time they peeled off someone off the bottom. And then by the time, and Leo obviously I heard would whisper around and was going around and was doing some good organizing. I understood that a couple of chairs of committees might have been chairs of committees as a result of, say, where were the Butte votes going to go, for example. That's always a challenge. And, but that, in the end, it was he and Mags Osheim. Mags from up in Glasgow. And do you recall when it got down to that vote, well, he prevailed against Mags, and then it was, did the Republicans actually, they put a name up as just a token or something to do it, just for competition?
I'm sure it happened.
Yeah. But eventually it became a rural Democrat, Mags, against an urban Democrat, and Leo prevailed, and then he took over operations.
It wasn't a wide margin in the vote. I don't remember exactly.
Very narrow.
It was very narrow that Leo got elected.
It was fortuitous. And Mags was a great guy. He was the legislative chairman of our committee. And he was a very good guy, but he couldn't have done the job that Leo did. Nobody could.
Yeah.
And it was proven during the convention, because once in a while Leo had to be excused. I remember on one occasion we were discussing one of my favorite articles. Louise Cross was the chair of the environmental article. You know, we have a right to a clean and healthful environment. It was a very controversial article, but when we had to discuss the water issue in that article, Leo had to be excused for some reason or another. And so someone had to be appointed, temporary chair while he was gone. And the person who was appointed took over at 3-something, I remember, in the afternoon. 4 hours later, we'd gone round and round, and we were right back where we started. And this person was very gifted, a lawyer, but couldn't run the meeting the way Leo had. And had Leo been there, I think in an hour we could have moved on, but 4 hours later, we were nowhere. But
sometimes you don't know what you have until you miss it.
Right, and we really missed Leo that day. I remember it vividly. He just knew how to conduct that meeting, and he did it with humor. And as Mr. Toole pointed out, he was always fair. But when he said we're not going to cut off debate, some of us thought, oh my gosh, because we had some people there who had been legislators, and some of them were very long-winded. I wasn't exactly short-winded myself, but he didn't cut off debate.
No, I think it was the way Leo handled things that you could speak as long as you felt you needed, but it didn't go on and on, Arlene, like it did that one day. It just was his way of handling.
Did he have a way of letting people know that this has already been said?
Yes,
so
redundant. It was redundant. He let people know, haven't we heard this just a few years ago?
We're being a little redundant here. And then,
but it was just a neat way, or the way that he handled things. He just had a mind that worked so well that way.
He obviously had a feel for the body. In the episode in which we discussed the environmental provisions and the preamble, where Maynann Ellingson and Bob Campbell are talking about it, and they talked about the adoption of the section of the Constitution that about having the environmental rights. the right to a clean and healthful environment language was critical in Montana's Constitution, and that had been discussed and apparently voted on in different ways
Yes.
7 times.
Down.
And down. And a lot of, hey, we can't have this, it'll create litigation. I mean, the irony of lawyers were saying, let's not have litigation, always struck me as interesting. But finally, Maine, it was getting more and more votes, and Maine Ann got pretty close. And so Bob Campbell got up and spoke on it, but people were getting ready to leave.
That's
It was the end of the day. And
was
for
sad.
some reason, they started rustling around in this, and Bob made his motion, and they voted it down, and it, instead of getting the last remaining votes, they lost about 10 votes. And man, he was ready to give up, and as everyone was rustling around getting ready, this page came up and handed him a note. And the note said, "Try it again, Leo." And he could sense the body, and so Bob got up and Leo recognized him, and Bob said, "I didn't know what to say, I'd already said it." But anyway, he started into it a little bit, and he said, "Mr. President, I'm having trouble being heard because people are getting ready to leave." And apparently Leo rapped the gavel
He was upset.
very loudly, more loudly than he did for the entire convention, and said, "Let's stop everything and listen to this. This is important." And everyone stopped and listened, and Bob made up a pretty good little thing about, well, what are you going to say at home, that we just have an environment or we have a clean and healthful environment? And they took the vote and it passed.
It made all the difference in the world. Had he not been chair, that would have just died.
And think about
Louise
that.
Cross and the rest of us who were very strongly in favor of right to a clean and healthful environment really thank Leo and Bob for standing up and speaking out. And when it came up again,
Yeah.
people voted for it, and it wound up in our Constitution. Not once, but twice.
Yeah,
in
it
the
ended
Bill of
up in
Rights
the Bill of
that-
Rights too.
and in the
Yeah.
environmental.
And in
But-
fact, the Bill of Rights, it ended up in the inalienable rights
Right.
section,
First.
which is a very, very important thing. But it struck me that he both commanded the respect of the body, that when he rapped, made the
That's
noise
right.
and said, "Now let's pay attention to this, it's
That's right.
important." They listened, and also that he read the body pretty well, apparently.
Well, and Leo was so good about having these little notes and sending them out to someone that maybe they would help or something would be done that way, and was interesting.
So,
He was very concerned about what was going on, and at one point, Betty Babcock, who was a wonderful delegate as far as the social activities were concerned, she was having a big party for the delegates, and it was slated for 5:30, and the day was going on, and people were rambling on, and then one of the delegates got up to make a motion, and really, what that motion was to let people know that Betty Babcock's preparing this big party for us, and we're never going to get done. And so Leo kind of paid attention to that toward the end. He says, "Don't worry, you're going to make Betty's party," you know. And he controlled it to the point where we were just in time for Betty's party.
Yeah.
He was just so understanding and so,
yeah,
he was great with that gavel.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, so you saw a number of yellow stickers come out from
At
the.
least one, particularly that I still have today.
And it was interesting that his reflections. I was looking at the book that came out a few years ago, and Leo wrote in there a couple things I want to just read as a reminder. He said, "I'm sure that all of us who are mature admit, or at least understand, that we live in a society unusually dominated by envy, fear, gluttony, and greed. Envy in the form of advertising and keeping up with our neighbors, fear in the form of societal and peer pressure, gluttony in the form of conspicuous consumption, and greed in the form of profits. These are the models for our children in school through athletics and social pressures. Gains are always rewarded and losses are to be avoided like punishment. Our system is one of competition and definitely still one of survival of the fittest. Our legislative bodies, both national and state, reflect these characteristics. And legislators who accept the system not only survive but often succeed. How does it happen then that 100 men and women drawn together in a political process called a constitutional convention were largely able to overcome these characteristics of our society and fashion a new constitution which greatly improved on the old and in many respects set a high standard for Montana and for other states who have adopted parts of it as well? The members of the Constitutional Convention in 1972 were an unusual group. They were, on the whole, inquisitive, studious, well-meaning, and sincerely interested in improving Montana's political system. For the most part, they were not seasoned politicians. With the exception of a few former state legislators, they were persons interested by nature or vocation in the political process, but who had not participated before as elected officials. And then he talks about how it was the Supreme Court decision that stopped legislators from coming in. Then he says the delegates brought none of the acrimony and bitterness of the convention that often develops between seasoned politicians with preconceived positions on major state issues. Instead, the delegates usually approached the principal issues before the conventions in an objective manner, and they sought to avoid most of the pressures to which the legislatures were subjected. Lobbyists were generally unwelcome. It was an interesting thought. Delegates organized into committees collected information, so on and so forth. And so he saw the Constitution being an opportunity that it was free of that kind of bitterness and divisiveness that is much worse today than it was back then, but it still prevailed at that time. So can you speak to that a little bit more and about how he worked both sides?
Well, I think, as we've said before, seating the delegates alphabetically had so much to do with it. It didn't matter whether, where you might have started with the A's clear up front and you get down to the last man at the end here, but but it was the sort of thing that you didn't have those within your party leaning over your back all the time or doing this all the time that you ought to do this and ought to do that, at least as I saw it that way. And then Leo in handling how things went along the way, and he got to know, he was great in knowing who you were. He knew many from before, but knowing who you were. And
that we respected everyone enough to know them.
Yes, did that. I think that had a great bit to do with
I think we all as human beings appreciate when someone looks us in the eye and knows who we are.
Yeah, calls you by name.
Say, I see you, I know you. Yeah.
And with some it's not that easy, but with Leo it at least to me seemed to really.
Now, when you adopted the lobbyist rules, and I know he was part of that rule procedure, the rule required the lobbyists to disclose how much money they were spending. That was not in Montana law, and it was not required prior to that.
And we didn't go to lobbyist functions and parties and legislature. They do that all the time.
They were pretty lonely at those functions, I hear. I hear they picked up some good roast beef and no one wanted to go eat it or something like that.
But the point is that Leo understood that a lot of people have pride of authorship, and in the legislature it runs rampant. When they have pride of authorship, what they're doing, even though a House might introduce something that's very similar to the Senate, but it's a little different wording, and the Senator introduced it here and the House member here, there's that pride of authorship, but somehow the delegates, all 100 of us, I think, we kind of relinquished that pride of authorship. I know that the unicameral was very important to me, the one house, and yet toward the end, when we realized that if we put that unicameral into the body of the Constitution, we might have lost the whole Constitution, I was the one who made the motion. Let's just not put the unicameral in. Let's give the people an option, along with capital punishment and gambling. They were sub-options. And I think the pride of authorship is still running rampant today at every level of government, city, county, state. People do something, they want it to be recognized as theirs sometimes, but we lost that, don't you think, in the Constitutional Convention?
You know, it is interesting that that I'm sure that he allowed people to have a level of ego about what they were doing without it letting it take over.
Right.
I want to go back a bit to organization, and I'm going to take a second and reflect on something that last summer, or last September when we met and had dinner at May Ann's, I happened to be sitting right. You were next to me, as was Marshall Murray. And we actually were hoping to have Marshall on this program, but he was not able to make this session. So I'm going to try to accurately describe what he said at that dinner. He said that when you finished the first day of organizing and Leo had been elected chair or president of the convention, that the full camaraderie and unanimity had not evolved yet, and that everyone went to their rooms that night. And he said we were staying at the Colonial Inn. He said, and we were tipping a few drinks in Jim Felt's room, and he and Jim Felt, and he said somebody else, I can't remember who it was. They were having a couple of drinks, and they were talking about, well, how are we going to? It was a bit of a partisan discussion. How are we going to, as Republicans, make it? How can we be heard? And we might have to fight it out over these committees, and they were starting to be a little bit combative in their own minds and in their discussion. And the phone rang in Felt's room, and the voice at the end of the line said, "Is Marshall Murray there?" And they said, "Yeah." And so Marshall got up and answered and said, "Hello," and it was Leo. He had somehow ferreted out that they were all together in there. And he said, "Would you come to my room?" And so Marshall got up and went to the room, and Leo, when he walked in, he said, Leo asked him, "Okay, so now what are you Republicans all about at this convention? What do you want to get done?" And Marshall said, I told him, well, we're not sure how this is all going to work, but we're interested in forging the best constitution for the people of Montana that I think we can pass. And Leo said, well, okay, if that's what you want, then I want you to take this back for discussion amongst your peers in the Republican side, knowing they had just come from Felt's room, former Speaker of the House, Jim Felt. And he said, we're going to name half the committees are going to be Republican, and half the committees, if you guys will fight for a good, not have a big partisan thing, but fight for a good convention, a good constitution, half the committees will go to Democrats and half to Republicans, and then the co-chairs will be of the other party, and we'll do all that. And then I would want you, Marshall, to be the chairman of the Rules Committee. And so why don't you guys take that back and chew on it? And so Marshall said he went back and said, here's what Leo wants to do. And they kind of concluded at that time that they ought to go right along with all that. He also said that he then went to Leo and said, well, where's my draft of the rules I can work with? And Leo said, we don't have a draft of rules. You're going to have to start from zero.
Well, and he was a good one to get involved in. It was the same where he and John Schultz were with style and drafting.
Yeah.
You couldn't have had better, at least to me, better
Schultz did a great job.
individual. Yeah, yes.
They did a great job.
And so the rules that they did actually then, because of the wonderful staffing, they immediately gathered a bunch of rules, Marshall said, from other conventions, looked at them, and then he formulated the rules, and they adopted them, and it was in that rules that they spread out spread the wealth, so to speak, if you will. It wasn't to the victor go the spoils. It was Montana gets the benefit. And so that was a very interesting story that Marshall told, and I wish he could be here to share that directly with us, but it told a lot about.
You told it well, and you know there's an analogous situation with the legislature. They have caucuses, and when the Democratic caucus and the Republican caucus, there's no meeting of the minds of that nature. I mean, they're separate, and they want their own way, and I think that Leo handled that so beautifully behind the scenes. I mean, that was kind of a mini caucus that Felt and Marshall Murray had, and the other leading Republicans.
You know, the thing that stuck out with me, because I'm an old political hand, was it wasn't what he said, it was the fact that he knew Marshall Murray was sitting in that room behind closed doors. Now there's a guy that knew what was going on.
Oh yeah, he knew.
He had things sorted out. I mean, just because I've been in those situations where people say, "Well, where's so and so? What do you suppose is going on here?" Everything else. Well, clearly Leo had ferreted out what was going on and was probably concerned that it could go the wrong way.
Right.
And with wrong leadership, it could well have gone the wrong way. And given the fact that it passed by 2,500 votes. Had it been partisan and divisive, it had never passed.
Right.
And we'd have been operating under the old Constitution, as archaic as that was.
Yes. Now, rarely do you hear criticism of the Constitution in total. You hear people saying, we're lucky to have this Montana Constitution. That's very reassuring.
You know, it's a model for many other states. When we look at it, I think Leo spoke and said that, I think he said in here that when it was ratified, this Constitution, the only complete revision of a Constitution for several decades in the United States, that in fact other states, there was a lot of fuss and fury going on about revising and modernizing government in that period of time. And a number of states either tried to call conventions and didn't succeed, or did succeed in calling the conventions but didn't get the job done. And that standing head and shoulders above everyone else was this effort in Montana, which to this day now people say is, if not the best, at least one of the two best state constitutions in the United States.
It's truly remarkable. And when you look at that decision on chair, it was really fortuitous that Louise Cross was named the chair of that Environmental Natural Resources Committee, because most of the people on that committee were not environmentally interested. And yet, what did we wind up with? Thanks to the very structure, the fact that Louise was chair and everything worked out the way it did. And that is in other committees too. It was very important that it turned out.
Well, this idea of coming up with the committee came out with a draft. It was discussed, and then it was passed on section by section, with motions and discussions, and then it was sent off for
style and drafting.
Style and drafting.
Yes.
And you know, the word guides so much, and I think we see it. I see it today in presidential politics, how the use of language.
Words matter.
Words matter, where every word matters. And so taking the time to do that and to bring it back again, it reads well. He was, tell me what you know, as much as you know, about And I know neither of you were in the administrative side.
Right.
I know Jean was, but we've lost her now. And she spoke about the meetings that they had, the regular meetings of the administrative group, which were the officers and then a couple others. Did you interface with that at all, or get a sense of what they did when they gathered together?
I do not. I don't have.
I don't really either. I wasn't involved with the administrative aspect. I was interested in public information because I had done television work, and after the Constitution was signed by the delegates, I was among those who went out and tried to promote it on television and radio. We had to do that on our own.
Leo did too.
Oh, Leo,
Because
yes.
I know I was on with him doing, you know.
Leo did that. And Margaret Warden was on that information committee. But that was very important in trying to get the word out. And the League of Women Voters helped tremendously. And other citizen groups. Citizen groups were very important in this whole project throughout the state. And citizen proposals, remember how many citizen proposals we had?
Well, it was ironic that in the management of the thing, they saved up money that they could spend to promote it, and then the Farm Bureau came in and said, well, we don't think you should be able to do that. And the court said, you can't.
We didn't have any
so
money.
you went from $40,000 budget to maybe promote it to nothing, and then raised and cobbled together about $10,000 to
try to
promote it, and that was it.
Get the information
Think
out
about
statewide. Most of us just did it pro bono. We just did it. We devoted our time to trying to get the word out. But there was no money. The money that was left after the convention, because we did it in record time, we had money left, that went back to the state. You ever hear of money going back to the state?
Well, it is,
legislature?
but it does speak to the good administration. And I think you noted that the comment from Delegate Toole about him marshaling the resources well, so that
Watched every penny. Watched every penny.
You know, I know Brian Schweitzer always tells me, you know, if you count the pennies, the dollars will follow. So
That's
don't
right.
miss a thing. And that certainly is real.
At the very end, Margaret Warden presented something to Leo, and it was beautiful wrapping paper, and he says, can we save this paper? Did we pay for this paper? It was right in the proceedings. I got a big kick
Let me
out of
take
it.
just a second and ask you, as we get close to the end here, your reflections, just a brief reflections on being a constitutional convention, what it meant to you in your life.
Well, it's been the highlight of one of the highlights of my life, going and working with others throughout the state and getting to know them through all these years, and the great individuals, and I couldn't have had a better time, and respect that I've received from that, and about our document, the respect that I hear today. It's been the great thing to be part of that.
Well, I'm sure you're proud of your efforts, and we're proud of your efforts too, and we're appreciative of your efforts, I can tell you that. And your
Well, the
thoughts
society
again.
means a lot to me, and Bob Campbell is the glue that holds our society together. There are 100 delegates, only 19 of us still alive, but we still meet. But the point is that we forgot all about our original partisan labels. I mean, over the years, we had wonderful reunions. I remember Torrey Johnson, who was one of the ultra-conservatives. He had a wonderful party at his ranch with branding and everything else. And then some of the very liberal delegates, you know, but we all had a certain camaraderie. There's something about being a delegate that transcends political parties the way they exist today.
And that, I think Leo helped build
Right,
that. Well, you know, again, the Constitution itself is such an important thing for Montana, and your roles are in it are extraordinarily important. Leo's role, it's unfortunate weren't able to film him, but we have his records and his thoughts, the way people thought about him. But the proof's in the pudding. Wrong leadership, partisan leadership, or just not good leadership, we'd have had a different product. We probably wouldn't have had a new Constitution. So when you look upon it and think about the value of that to the state of Montana, we have folks like you to appreciate it, but also we have to appreciate the leadership of Leo Graybill, who was essentially playing against type when he became that wonderful nonpartisan leader of that group. And so we're very appreciative of everything you did, and thank you for taking part in this program, and
Thank
we look forward to you on the next episode of In the Crucible of Change.
Thank you.
Thank you.